Witnesses are the sun during the day and the moon during the night. The demigods also witness, but the conditioned soul thinks that his attempts at sense gratification are not being witnessed by anyone. Sometimes, when he is detected by temporarily renounced, sorry. Sometimes, when he is detected, he temporarily renounces everything. But due to his great attachment for the body, his renunciation is given up before he can attain perfection. In this material world, there are many envious people. There is the tax exacting government, which is compared to an owl, and there are invisible crickets that create unbearable sounds. The conditioned soul is certainly greatly harassed by the agents of material nature, but his intelligence is lost due to undesirable association. In an attempt to gain relief from the disturbances of material existence, he falls victim to so-called yogis, sadhus, and incarnations who can display some magic but who do not understand devotional service. Sometimes the conditioned soul is bereft of all money and consequently he becomes unkind to his family members. In this material world, there is not a pinch of actual happiness for which the conditioned soul is longing life after life. The government officials are like carnivorous rakshasas who exact heavy taxes from the maintenance of the government. The hard-working conditioned soul is very saddened due to these heavy taxes. The path of fruitive activities leads to difficult mountains, and sometimes the conditioned soul wants to cross these mountains, but he is never successful, and consequently he becomes more and more aggrieved and disappointed. Becoming materially and financially embarrassed, the conditioned soul unnecessarily chastises his family. In the material condition, there are four principal needs, out of which sleep is compared to a python. When asleep, the conditioned soul completely forgets his real existence, and in sleep, he does not feel the tribulations of material life. Sometimes, being in need of money, the conditioned soul steals and cheats, although he may apparently be associated with devotees for spiritual advancement. His only business is getting out of the clutches of Maya, but due to improper guidance, he becomes more and more entangled in material dealings. This material world is simply an embarrassment and is composed of tribulations presented as happiness, distress, attachment, enmity, and envy. On the whole, it is simply full of tribulation and misery. When a person loses his intelligence due to attachment to wife and sex, his entire consciousness becomes polluted. He thus only thinks of the association of women. The time factor, which is like a serpent, takes away everyone's life, including that of Lord Brahma, and the insignificant ant. Sometimes the conditioned soul tries to save himself from inexorable time and thus takes shelter of some bogus savior. Unfortunately, the bogus savior cannot even save himself. How then can he protect others? The bogus saviors do not care for bona fide knowledge received from qualified brahmanas and Vedic sources. Their only business is indulging in sex and recommending sexual freedom, even for widows. Thus, they are like monkeys in the forest. Srila Shukadeva Goswami thus explains the material forest and its difficult path to Maharaj Parikshit. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So, are there any questions about that? Material existence. No questions. Okay, text one. Oh, yeah. And you disagree with that? Well, as Prabhupada teaches, it's a misnomer actually. One does get some enjoyment in the material world, the senses contacting sense objects. Krishna, of course, describes that's the source of misery. So generally, which we do have plenty of experience in the material world, that the senses contacting the sense objects, and they lead to various embarrassing situations and so on, which is completely miserable. But what happens is, in between two miserable situations, there's a little relief, and that relief is termed as happiness. So it's actually a misnomer, which, just like in the material world, living entities are very easily bewildered by names. Just like you can buy one shirt at Payless for $10, and you can buy the same shirt at the store that says Eddie Bauer, and it costs $50. And just because of a name, everyone's consciousness is completely bewildered. Or, in the case of like religion, they give religion a bad name, and therefore you don't have to consider the validity or the viability of it. Just like, for example, a devotee may protest something at some big seminar or something, and all someone has to say is he's a fundamentalist. And everyone's just like, oh, okay, then no need to consider what he's saying seriously because he's a fundamentalist. So in this way, the jivas in the material world are easily bewildered by names. You just give a dog a bad name and hang it, right? That's what Prabhupada is told like this. So in that way, this word it's a misnomer. I'm happy. When you get a little relief from two distressful situations, and someone terms that as happiness, it's a misnomer. And that way, his illusion continues on account of false names, giving false names to false experiences. Any other comments, questions? All right, text one. Text one has a long word-to-word thing, so I don't think I'll go through that. It's not necessary. We'll just read the translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. This is text one. Even the translation is quite long. When King Parshit asked Shukadeva Goswami about the direct meaning of the material force, Shukadeva Goswami replied as follows. My dear king, a man belonging to the mercantile community, Vanik, is always interested in earning money. Sometimes he enters the forest to acquire some cheap commodities like wood and earth and sell them in the city at good prices. Similarly, the conditioned soul, being greedy, enters this material world for some material profit. Gradually, he enters the deepest part of the forest, not really knowing how to get out. Having entered the material world, the pure soul becomes conditioned by the material atmosphere, which is created by the external energy under the control of Lord Vishnu. Thus, the living entity comes under the control of the external energy, Daivi Maya. Living independently and bewildered in the forest, he does not attain the association of devotees, who are always engaged in the service of the Lord. Once in the bodily conception, he gets different types of bodies one after the other under the influence of material energy and impelled by the modes of material nature, sattva guna, raja guna, and tama guna. In this way, the conditioned soul goes sometimes to the heavenly planets, sometimes to the earthly planets, and sometimes to the lower planets and lower species. Thus, he suffers continuously due to different types of bodies. These sufferings and pains are sometimes mixed, sometimes they are very severe, and sometimes they are not. These bodily conditions are acquired due to the conditioned soul's mental speculation. He uses his mind and five senses to acquire knowledge, and these bring about the different bodies and different conditions. Using his senses under the control of the external energy, Maya, the living entity, suffers the miserable conditions of material existence. He is actually searching for relief, but he is generally baffled, although sometimes he is relieved after great difficulty. Struggling for existence in this way, he cannot get the shelter of pure devotees who are like bumblebees engaged in loving service at the lotus feet of Lord Vishnu. Purport. The most important information in this verse is Hari Guru Charana Aravinda Madhukara Anupadavim. In the material world, the conditioned souls are baffled by their activities, and sometimes they are relieved after great difficulty. On the whole, the conditioned soul is never happy, he simply struggles for existence. Actually, his only business is to accept the spiritual master, the Guru, and through him, he must accept the lotus feet of the Lord. This is explained by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Guru Krishna Prasade Pai Bhakti Lata Bija. People struggling for existence in the forest or cities in the material world are not actually enjoying life. They are simply suffering different pains and pleasures, generally pains that are always inauspicious. They try to gain release from these pains, but they cannot due to ignorance. For them, it is stated in the Vedas, Ta Vignanartam Sagunome Vabhigachet. When the living entity is lost in the forest of the material world in the struggle for existence, his first business is to find a bona fide guru who is always engaged to the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vishnu. After all, if he is at all eager to be relieved of the struggle for existence, he must find the bona fide guru and take instructions at his lotus feet. In this way, he can get out of the struggle. Since the material world is compared herein to a forest, it may be argued that in Kali Yuga, modern civilization is mainly situated in the cities. A great city, however, is like a great forest. Actually, city life is more dangerous than life in the forest. If one enters an unknown city without friend or shelter, living in that city is more difficult than living in a forest. There are many big cities all over the surface of the globe, and whenever one looks, he sees the struggle for existence going on 24 hours a day. People rush about in cars going 70 and 80 miles an hour, constantly coming and going, and this sets the scene of the great struggle for existence. One has to rise early in the morning, not for Mangalarti, and travel in that car at breakneck speed. There is always the danger of an accident, and one has to take great care. In his automobile, the living entity is full of anxieties, and his struggle is not at all auspicious. Apart from human beings, other species like cats and dogs are also struggling very hard day and night for existence. Thus, the struggle for existence continues, and the conditioned soul changes from one position to another. For a while, he is a child, but he has to become a boy. From a boy, he has to change into a youth, and from youth to manhood and old age. Finally, when the body is no longer workable, he has to accept a new body in a different species. Giving up the body is called death, and accepting another body is called birth. The human form is an opportunity to take shelter of the bona fide spiritual master, and through him the Supreme Lord. This Krishna consciousness movement has been started to give an opportunity to all the members of human society who are misled by foolish leaders. No one can get out of the struggle for existence, which is full of miseries, without accepting a pure devotee of the Lord. The material attempt changes from one position to another, and no one actually gains relief from the struggle for existence. The only resort is the lotus feet of a bona fide spiritual master, and through him the lotus feet of the Lord. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. 2 chapters ago, we had heard, I think Shukadeva Goswami was explaining the point that by asanga susanga jata, by giving up bad association and accepting good association, asanga means bad association. It was the last verse in chapter 12. Asanga susanga, susanga means sadhus, association with sadhus. Then from that action of rejecting bad association, accepting good association, then jata means to take birth. Something takes birth from that action. And what takes birth from that action is the sword of knowledge. Gyanasina eva vivrikna moha. And with the sword of knowledge, one can cut up one's moha, one's illusion. And then after that, one should hear Harikatha. Katana Shrutavya, Hari Katana Shrutavya. One should absorb himself in hearing Harikatha, and in that way one can attain the spiritual kingdom of God. So that verse was told is a very nice verse. Love Dashmitan. One can gain remembrance of the Supreme Lord. That was the last verse of chapter 12. So without cutting up one's illusory attachments, then one may not benefit much from the process of hearing and chanting. So therefore, both actions are told. So to put us on the horse of detachment in chapter 13, the calamity of material life was detailed by using various metaphors and analogies. Because the living entity should become convinced about the calamity of material life. And also he should examine that. He should, just like Pashanapina Pashati, Prabhupada says, in the big cities you can see suffering going on 24 hours a day. The key word here is you can see it. The question is, do you see it? Because Pashanapina Pashati, this statement of the Bhagavatam says, seeing but not examining. We see but we don't examine. So therefore, without examining, also we may not know what to examine for. If we've grown up in the cities, for example, our whole life, then it's normal. That's normal. It's just like if you go to a place that smells really, really bad. I don't know if you've ever been on like the train or the subway and it smells really, really bad. Have you ever had that experience? Or been in some area where you have to smell something that smells really horrible? But after 10 minutes, you get used to it. And then that same horrible smell doesn't seem to affect you so much, right? Because you get adjusted to it. The living entity can practically get adjusted to any miserable condition, even hell. He can adjust. Okay, I got a little bit of enjoyment over here, a little bit of enjoyment over there. He can make adjustments. Similarly, having grown up in Chicago, let's say one's whole life, then he only knows excruciating winters. He doesn't know any other concept than an excruciating winter. So when it's like 20 degrees below zero, that's normal. He feels it's completely normal. Just make a couple of adjustments and that's life goes on. But someone comes from like California to Chicago and he's like, what is this nonsense? We have to get out. He's like, this is completely normal. And the guy from California is bewildered. And the guy from Chicago, he's also bewildered. They're bewildered talking to each other. The guy from California is like, this is not normal. And the guy from Chicago, this is normal. So someone who's transcendental and someone who's not, when they come together, they can't understand each other at all. Because their intelligence is functioning differently. That verse from Bhagavad Gita, what is a time of awakening for the common man is night for the self-control. And night for the common man is a time of awakening for the introspective sage. So Prabhupada's first statement in that sentence is that this verse is describing two types of intelligence. So when there's different types of intelligence helps us to recognize of something as something. According to Kapila Dev's teaching, is when we talk about what the eye sees, it just sees colors, shapes, and sizes. But we don't just see colors, shapes, and sizes. We actually recognize something as something. Right when you walk into a room, you immediately ascertain this is an altar, this is Vyasa-san, this is etc. And that's our intelligence has been trained in that way, so we can recognize those things. Whereas someone who doesn't come to the temple or let's say for the first time, like sometimes you see guests come to the temple and they walk around, they're taking a look at the pictures, and they feel a little tired, so they sit on the Vyasa-san. Oh, here's a nice little seat. It's nice. Those seats look a little bit hard, but this one looks like my couch at home. So they immediately come and just sit on the Vyasa-san. And then if you go up to them and say you can't sit there, they look bewildered. But then there's a seat. Because they don't recognize that this is supposed to be the seat of Vyasa, where you're supposed to represent spiritual knowledge. So our intelligence helps us to recognize different things. So when a spiritualist and a materialist, they try to have a discussion with each other, that they can't understand each other as such. Of course, the spiritualists can understand that the materialistic person is in Maya, but they can't understand. So my point is that we may not know how to examine material existence in order to detach ourselves from it. That's the point that I'm making. Because we've grown up here our whole life in the material world. In fact, the word used here is anadi samsara anubhavasya. And Prabhupada translates this as of the perception of the beginninglessness process of transmigration. So we've been here in the material world since forever, basically. And therefore we've become quite adjusted to it. So therefore, if you ask the conditioned soul to examine the miseries of material life, he may not be able to do that very successfully. Because what is actually miserable, he thinks to be normal. Like being forced into a sexual engagement is actually a great misery. But he thinks it to be quite nice. Not even, he thinks it to be wonderful. Krishna says in the 11th canto Bhagavatam that searching after a sex life constitutes real misery. But no one believes in that. If you were to tell it to the average conditioned soul, they may not accept. So they don't know how to examine material existence to detach themselves from it. So Shukadeva Goswami has presented chapter 13, and now that chapter is being further delineated here in chapter 14. And it's supposed to help us examine the calamity of material life, thus detaching ourselves from it. And then it will be easier to do the second half of the verse that I quoted in the beginning of class, which is engage in Shravanam and Kirtanam with greater absorption, without the attachments encumbering the hearing and chanting process. Because normally most of the time we find it very difficult to just hear and chant about Krishna because our hearts are encumbered by various material attachments, either to family life or to what, school life, or whatever, etc. So then you can't concentrate very deeply. So now that's what's being described. So it's a good chapter to study and then perceive in the material world in order to help our hearts become a little bit more detached from material existence. That's the idea here. So in this verse, it's very simply presented that just as a merchant enters into the forest with the hope of, um, how you say, um, gathering some wood and some earth with an attempt to sell it in a future place. So similarly, the living entity enters into the forest of this material world with the hope of enjoying the so-called taste of material happiness. Unfortunately, just as one enters into a deep forest and gets lost, I don't know if you ever have that experience of walking in a forest and getting lost. Probably you were intelligent enough to stay on the beaten path. But that it's very easy actually to get bewildered in the forest because I have the experience a couple of times. You go to the forest and then you have to go to the bathroom. So you enter a little bit deeper into the forest so no one will see you having to do something very embarrassing like go to the bathroom. And then you kind of like mark yourself, okay, I passed this tree, then I passed that rock, and then okay, I'll remember those few leaves there. You try to like mark it off in your mind. And then you go and do your business. And then when you have to go back to the road, you wait, is it this tree or that tree? One gets very bewildered. Wait a minute, that rock looks like that rock, so which one was it? And that way you can easily become lost and bewildered. And the only way you can get out of that situation is by screaming, actually. Like literally that's the only way you can get out. Of course, if there are dangerous animals in the forest, they might hear you too. So there isn't much time to get out of that situation. For example, similarly, the living entity enters into the forest in the material world, and he enters so deep into fruitive activity that the concept of getting out doesn't even occur to him anymore. That's the way the situation is. The concept of freedom is actually not a concept anymore. Just like now, um, modern civilization tells us this is our one and only life, this is our only body. So then when we devotees come and say you can transcend death, it's like that's a laughing matter, you know. In fact, looking into the future, we might have to be careful saying such things. They might lock us up, put us in a psychiatric ward for thinking such things, for telling there is a spiritual world and God is a cowherd boy. His complexion is a little bluish, and he dances with millions of gopis for a lifetime of Lord Brahma. And then, in the site, they're going to be marking all these things down on the paper. Okay, and who's Lord Brahma? Well, Lord Brahma, he's the first living entity in the universe. He has four heads, and from his four heads, there are mental sons that come up. They're the progenitors of the universe, and they're like human beings, but they give birth to all the various species of life, for which they're in. Okay. And where does Lord Brahma come from? Well, he's actually born from a lotus stem that comes from the body of Garbhodakshayi Vishnu. And who's Garbhodakshayi Vishnu? Oh, well, Garbhodakshayi Vishnu, he's the second expansion of Paramatma who fills half the universe with his own sweat. And then he lays down in that water on a serpent bed named Ananta. Okay, and where does Garbhodakshayi Vishnu? Well, he comes from the Mahavishnu. And Mahavishnu, when he breathes out, unlimited universes comes from his pores. And and when he breathes in, all the universes are destroyed. And that Mahavishnu comes from this cowherd boy named Krishna. He's an expansion of the cowherd boy in Vrindavan named Krishna. And then they're going to say, all right, this is a very severe case. They got to lock you up until you come to sanity. In other words, the way the material civilization is moving, the idea of transcendence is becoming totally irrelevant. And they're uninterested. And because the living entity, conditioned soul, has entered so deeply into fruitive activity, that's all he knows. There is no other such existence as such. Therefore, when they hear people joining the ashrams or suddenly leaving their material jobs and so on, they become bewildered. Why would a person do such a thing? This is what life is. And even when they are able to occasionally recognize the miseries of material life, oftentimes, at least on book distribution, I've heard this plenty of times. That's just a spice of life. They just have some cool cliche like that to try to reconcile their miserable experience and their desire for happiness. And no pain, no gain. Yesterday we heard no brain, no pain. I never heard that one before. That was good. And they also say no pain, no gain. So then they have these very cool cliches. Again, like I said in the beginning to his question, it's a name game that's going on in the material world. You give something a good name and people go after it. You give something a bad name and people avoid it. So they said things like this. The way they reconcile their desire for happiness and their actual experience of misery is by some cool cliche like no pain, no gain. And that way, there's always hope for future happiness. This is going on. And Prabhupada describes here, they adjust there's an adjustment. Material life is never really experiencing happiness, it's just adjusting to circumstances. This is another way one can realize they're actually the servant of some higher power. Because you're never really in control of anything, you're always a servant of circumstances. Isn't it? If you think about our life, we're never really factually in control of anything. Like you may apply for a few schools, but then the school that accepts you, that's the one you go to. So you're really, although you may think I chose the school, but actually this was the only option you had. You're actually serving the circumstances. So in this way, material life goes on. Of course, um, sometimes one is miserable and he's bewildered. And sometimes one experiences material enjoyment, but he's not satisfied, and then he's bewildered. So the general situation of conditioned life is bewilderment. So the only way out of such perplexity is by accepting the lotus feet of the spiritual master. So therefore, Srila Prabhupada said, this is the most important statement of the whole verse. Hari Guru Charana Aravinda Madhukara Anupadavim. He said, this is the most important statement of the whole verse. That the only way out of such perplexity is the lotus feet of the spiritual master. Just as Arjuna was driven into perplexity on account of attachment to family members. And in the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, he gives various statements. Due to his high intelligence, he gives various statements to argue why he should not fight in the war. But ultimately, even with his great intelligence, he could not get himself out of a bewildering situation. So that finally led him to surrendering to Krishna and seeking guidance from Krishna. So also Srila Prabhupada is told here that the whole purpose of human life, of course, due to our mental speculation, we are accepting one body after another, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a hog. And this is all due to our mental speculation, which is influenced by the modes of material nature. And then somehow or other, the human being attains a human form of life. And what is that human form of life meant for? Human form of life is meant for taking shelter of the lotus feet of spiritual master. That is what Prabhupada has mentioned here. There is no other purpose of the human form of life. Human form of life minus the shelter of the spiritual master is animal life. Because you cannot get out of the material existence. In other words, one remains ignorant just like a foolish animal without the lotus feet of the spiritual master. Durlabho manusho deho dehinam krishna bangura chachapi durlabam manye vaikuntha priya darshana. I quoted this verse many times. That the human form of life is very rarely attained, and that too it can drop down dead at any moment. No need for living to 80, 90, especially nowadays. And Tatarpi durlabam manye, but I think more rare than that, King Nimi says, Vaikuntha priya darshanam is the association of the devotees who are very dear to the Lord of Vaikuntha. Vaikuntha Priya Darshanam, to see such persons is even more rare. That means that the purpose of human form of life is to associate with sadhu and hear from him transcendental knowledge, which includes knowledge of the material world. And in that way, once human life becomes meaningful, he can get out of this forest. As I said, once you enter deep into the forest and you are lost, probably the only way you can get out is if you can scream. And if a ranger happens to hear you, a forest ranger who knows how to navigate the forest very nicely, then he can come to your rescue and put you on the beaten road out of the forest. So similarly, the spiritual master is like a forest ranger. And by screaming out for his mercy, by seeking his shelter, then he can put us on the path of pure devotional service, which will lead us out of the material world into the lotus feet of Krishna. Those human beings who choose not to take this information seriously, then they continue on in the material world, you know, trying to adjust to the circumstances of life, remaining utterly unhappy. So then the purpose of our life is clearly marked here from Prabhupada's purport. Now you just have to follow that. So are there any questions or comments? Anyone wants to say anything? Pretty straightforward stuff. No? Okay.
Human form of life is taking the shelter of the spiritual master, lotus feet of the spiritual master. My question is the shelter, taking shelter of a spiritual master. Shelter itself is in his instruction or taking shelter of his vapu or both?
Yeah, both. In the beginning, there should be, of course, the main thing to be gained from the spiritual master is his instruction. He's not different from Krishna because he's delivering to the living entity Krishna's instructions. So Krishna is guru, and the spiritual master embodies those instructions, so he's considered non-different from Krishna. So it is the instruction or the shiksha that is ultimately to be gained from guru, and the vapu is just like a vessel meant for transmitting the shiksha, which is Krishna's shiksha, to the living entities for their ultimate freedom from material existence. So the shiksha is the main thing to be gained from the association of the spiritual master. Of course, the vapu is generally important in the very beginning. That it has its value, its worth. Just like we hear that the water that washes the feet of the devotee, the dust of his feet, and his food remnants are three things which have great power. Mahabala, great strength actually is the word used. Mahabala means great strength for bestowing Krishna prema. So that means that the vapu of the pure devotee is not a joke either. That's also very nice, from one who can get that vapu. Generally, the emphasis on shiksha is there because as conditioned souls struggling with the mind and senses, manashashtani jnani pakritistani karshati. Part of the struggle is our senses tend to mislead us in our perception of things. Like, for example, our senses tell us material life is nice, and that Krishna is just a stone on the altar, and that the spiritual master is an ordinary human being. So why should I surrender to an ordinary human being? That doesn't make any sense. Our senses deceive us in that way. Therefore, shiksha is emphasized. Because our vision of the vapu is generally very materialistic when we commit offenses. But the vapu is important. In the very beginning of a disciple's life, the vapu has its tremendous value. Although there are certain cases of persons not getting that. Like some people some of Prabhupada's disciples never actually saw him. And they're tremendous preachers in our movement today. And others did see him and they fell down as such. So that type of example just shows us the importance of the shiksha is the main thing to be had. And the shiksha will continue even after the vapu disappears. So the shiksha is eternal. So we mainly say take the instructions of the spiritual master. But his vapu is very nice too. And Chaitanya Charitamrita Anchalila, where Sanatana Goswami is going to commit suicide, on account of his vapu having so much poison and pus and from the boils, and Lord Chaitanya chastised him and said that his body was actually apakrita deha. He said, your body is completely spiritual. And in fact, Krishna put you in this condition just to test me. Mahaprabhu says like this, just to test me to see if I'm seeing you materially. Because Mahaprabhu will come and embrace him every time. He had pus coming out of those things. Now, if you saw a devotee like that, you might visit him and say, Prabhu, how are you doing from a distance? And he said, Prabhu, why are you standing so far back? Just in case it's contagious. I don't want to get it myself. It'd be very difficult to overcome the vision of a devotee's body being infected in that way. But Mahaprabhu used to embrace him every day. And Sanatana Goswami felt so bad about this that he wanted to commit suicide. And of course, Lord Chaitanya being Antaryami, he chastised him. And he said, what is it? You've already given your body to me. Your body is my property. How can you dispose of someone else's property? That is a great offense. Haridas Thakur, tell him. Tell him, because Haridas Thakur was there also. Haridas Thakur, tell him. He's committing a great. Actually, Sanatana Goswami said, okay, I won't do it. I won't commit suicide. And then even after he said I wouldn't do it, he said, Haridas Thakur, tell him also. Chastise him. A 2-on-1 program. And then Mahaprabhu went on to say that your body is actually completely spiritual. And the reason your body is going to do this is because Krishna put your body like this just to test me. Just to test me to see if I would be judgmental. And had I been judgmental to you, then I would have been destroyed. Mahaprabhu says this to Sanatana Goswami. So the vapu of a great soul is very sacred and very valuable indeed. All of the shiksha is the main thing to be gave. Okay. Does anyone else want to say anything? Or no. Okay.
Prabhupada, on the morning walk in the Bombay, there is a Patel, some Patel, I forget his name. He always argues with Prabhupada. And Prabhupada got very much annoyed because of when he said that the body of spiritual master is material. Prabhupada fired anything like that, See, he said, how can you say like that? It's a great offense. As body of a spiritual master is spiritual. And there is no question of materials body. And who considers those things is a great offender. You cannot see his face even.
So a question comes, if the body is spiritual, why is it getting old? And that question, actually this question is brought up by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in the second canto. My body seems to be under the influence of the time factor. If the body is spiritual things are not under the influence of the time factor. So if spiritual body, why under the influence of time? Apparently so, at least.
The thing is that, yeah, it's a very nice question, but thing is that when one devotee, a pure becomes pure, purified, is always, merged in devotional service, his body becomes spiritual.
That's
And there is
okay.
no question of.
We don't doubt that, but doubt is coming to my mind. One doubt is coming to my mind. It's not a doubt. I actually know the answer, at least as presented by our charts. But if the body is spiritual body, then why does it appear to be under the influence of time?
Time is Krishna.
Time is Krishna. That's clever. This is actually one of the answers, is to give persons who are attached to the material processes conviction that whatever they're doing is actually still valid. But there's another reason also why the body, if anyone heard, remember. Another answer that is actually three answers that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, I only remember two of them, that's one of them. And another one I remember, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, Krishna wants to augment the devotee's attraction to him, actually. So by putting the material body to those conditions, the devotee's own desire for attaining Krishna and serving Krishna in his own spiritual swarup becomes augmented to a very high degree, thus bringing his love to an intensity which ultimately brings him to Krishna. So that's a nice point too. So the devotee appears to suffer like the non-devotees, but his suffering is quite different. Just like the same point, Jada Bharata or Bharata Maharaj, he took birth in the body of a deer, but we hear so many, if you take prasadam, guarantee human life, many of us are banking on that one on account of our weak practice. So just by eating prasadam, you get human form of life, or nehapi karma nashosti pratavayo navidite. And Maratobaya, the greatest fear is gliding down into the lower species. And yet, Bharata Maharaj is on the state of bhava. Bhava bhakti, that's a sadhya attainment. That's not even sadhana anymore. And yet, he attained the body of a deer. And the same answer comes early on in Prabhupada's purport. It is for augmenting loving sentiments to Krishna. And therefore, even in that body, Krishna gave him remembrance of his previous body. And that way, his love for Krishna actually increased in that difficult situation. So a way Krishna normally acts. So prepare yourself. If you're actually serious about getting Krishna, many of us may not be. So we may not take heed of the various suffering conditions of our life in a positive light. We may just complain about it. Most of us may do like that depending on our level of seriousness. But for those who are really serious about getting Krishna, then they will understand that this is how Krishna works. In order to increase his devotees' devotion to him, he will hide himself from their vision, from their consciousness even, and put them in a very bereft situation. You may compare that in Christian theology, I think they call it something like the dark night of the soul. And Krishna will do this again and again and again for the purpose of augmenting his devotees' love for him. Of course, that effect will only come for those who are really wanting Krishna. For those who don't really want Krishna, then such an experience may actually serve to sever his link to devotional service. And that's just on account of his own non-seriousness.
Hare Krishna. You mentioned in your last class that for a serious disciple, even one instruction is enough. And so I was wondering, so suppose the spiritual master gives you many instructions, but you take one and you really focus on that and you make that like the goal of all your everything you do. You try to really perfect that one, and even if it's something really simple, like I want you to study the Srimad Bhagavatam, you just take that instruction to heart. Would that really take you all the way to perfection? Like,
Generally, my understanding is that because spiritual things are absolute, so even one focus on one point starts to bring in the other fruits also at a later point. Like, for example, there are 26 qualities of a devotee given by Lord Chaitanya. There's not like the whole gamut of a devotee's qualities, but he gives a general 26. He says just by surrender to Krishna, all the other qualities will actually come up. So the main quality to really be concerned about is surrendering to Krishna. Krishna Ekasharnam. And other qualities begin to manifest themselves. So that's generally the nature of spiritual things. Fallen as we are, we may not be able to follow all the instructions. Of course, the minimum 4 recs, they have to be there. Our 16 rounds, our vows, but fallen as many of us may be, we may not be able to follow all the instructions, but if we can take one very seriously and show the spiritual master that this is my attempt to please you, then we may find a lot of mercy coming our way for sure. Why not? After all, they see that we're very fallen. And we were singing that song in the evening, Gauranga Karuna Karo, where Narottam Das Thakur says, "My dear Lord Chaitanya, if you do not give me your mercy, seeing how fallen I am, you see how fallen I am. If you do not give me your mercy, then why are you called as Patita Pavana? It doesn't make any sense." So, taking shelter of that particular statement of Narottam Das Thakur, we can definitely, as Prabhupada also says in Nectar of Instruction, that my spiritual master considered anyone who wasn't chanting 64 rounds to be fallen. But if you're serving Lord Chaitanya in this movement without duplicity, then certainly Lord Chaitanya will be very pleased with you. You will get his mercy. Like that. So, the Lord and the Lord's associates, Gaura Janapriya, they're all very merciful. That doesn't mean we can be rascals on purpose and expect mercy is going to flow, but they are very merciful indeed. You want to say something?
When we are in the forest and we are lost, the intelligence is always, we don't realize that we are lost. We are going deeper
Yeah,
deeper
that's
and deeper
right.
into the
Therefore,
forest.
we never attain the association of devotees. That point was made too, because we think we're okay. Who needs devotees? I'm good.
So like even if you meet a ranger accidentally, he's saying that, oh, you are in very deep into the forest, you cannot get out. We are not going to listen to him. So what's the scope of that?
There is no hope in that condition. Yeah, we're not gonna. So the devotee comes and he says, "You are suffering. You're in the forest of material enjoyment," and we're like, and then we do whatever we want. After that, no one cares for. That is the general situation. So there's another teacher that's there. Her name is Maya Devi, and she's very good. Her business is just keep whipping you until you get it. She's already whipping now, but you're thinking, I'm good. I can handle it. She's gonna keep beating you, life after life. You know, whip, huh? Whips hurt. Have you ever been spanked before? And some of you have been spanked before. Anyone here has been spanked before? Now, how many of you now when you get spanked with a belt, that's pretty tolerable actually. If any of you ever been hit with like an extension cord before, has anyone? So that an extension cord is just like a whip. So at least heavy scar on the body, and sometimes you start bleeding also an extension cord. That happened to me once. That was my mother. But I have other family members who did the heavy chastisement. And at least heavy scar on the body. And you'll be crying for about 2 hours because you can still feel it, even though 2 hours later you're still like, you can't believe it happened to you. And it leaves heavy scars. Sometimes you start bleeding also. So and right now we're thinking, oh, I can tolerate. Thompson to Crystal Barta. In fact, someone will say like that also. One guy at Northwestern, he told me like that. I'm saying, how do you deal with the suffering conditions of life? He said, I learned that from your coming from to the Bhakti yoga classes. I'm like, what did we learn to teach you to tolerate miserable conditions? He said, Krishna says, learn how to tolerate. That's what he told me. That's what he told me. I was like, wow. I said, I think that's a slight misapplication of the point. But he said that, and then he told me very sincerely, he said, that helped me out a lot. He told me very sincerely, like, and he wasn't lying. He's very, like, hardcore worker like that. So then, okay, all right, Maya, do your thing. And finally, at one fine life, living in May, if he's fortunate, realize that I'm suffering tremendously. And then that suffering gives rise to the desire for sadhu sangha. Bhaktivinoda Thakur tells this thing in Jaiva Dharma, that he's trying to explain the condition of the jiva in the conditioned world. And Brajanath is speaking to one Babaji, his name is Raghunath Das Babaji. So Brajanath is a little bit bewildered by the fact that the conditioned soul has been here for practically forever, basically forever. So he's like, how can Krishna be merciful and allow the jivas to go through such suffering conditions? Various questions that we would actually have. And so there, Bhaktivinoda Thakur tries to describe to these personalities that actually the suffering is very good. This is actually very good. In the same way, like if your hand is starting to burn, you know that you stick your hand in fire and it starts to burn, then you know that this is not a good thing. If you stuck your hand in fire and it didn't burn, then you will lose your hand, and that would be the result. So he tries to explain how suffering is very good, and through suffering, through continual suffering of the jiva, plus his desire for undiluted happiness, because that's what the jiva is looking for. He's looking for undiluted happiness. This is the word that is used, undiluted happiness. So the combination of suffering and the desire for undiluted happiness generates a desire for sadhu sangha. He may not think of it in his mind, sadhu sangha, but he starts to search out persons who can give answers. When the suffering is so acute, and his desire for undiluted happiness is also equally acute, so to speak. So in this way, Maya keeps beating us until we get the sense to really investigate, search out our highest welfare. I like that. Okay. Anything else? Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.